So this week we're going to be reciting our memory verses from Colossians 1. Colossians 1, we're going to be reciting verses 9 and 10. Yeah, this wasn't on. Thank you. All right. Colossians 1. Oh, it's better, right? Thank you, Raj. Colossians 1, verses 9 and 10. If you haven't had a chance to memorize it all entirely, that's okay. Feel free to read along with us. But we'll start and we'll try to recite it slowly. For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you and to ask that you be filled with the knowledge of God, spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. Let's read it one more time. For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you, and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. This passage was a real blessing to me this week, and I wanted to share a couple of thoughts as I considered this phrase, to please him in all respects, found in verse 10. That phrase really struck me, to please him in all respects. And I was seeking to understand this week, seeking the Lord to know, what does it mean to please you in all respects, and how do I know if I'm doing that? And I came across a passage which helped me understand this a little bit better, so I wanted to share it. It's Romans 14. And there are a couple of verses there in particular that I want to focus on. Verses 6 through 8. Romans 14, verses 6 through 8. It says, "He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord, or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's." And so what I see here is again, as I was thinking about this phrase of to please him in all respects, what I see is that daily things, everything, even daily things like eating, must be done for the Lord. That's a phrase that comes up in that passage again and again. For the Lord. For the Lord. And so, and the example is given that with many things, like eating, yes or no, whether you eat or whether you don't eat, both of them are potentially pleasing to the Lord. But the question in the decision is not an appeal to a command. Rather, it's a question of motivation. Am I doing it for the Lord? And what I saw, the things which are pleasing to God, and as Colossians says, to please him in all respects, what I saw from this passage in Romans is what pleases God are those things which are done for him. And that which displeases the Lord are the things which are done which don't bear him in mind at all, or are done for ourselves. And as I was looking this week at this week and being honest with myself, I had to admit that I notice a lot of things that I do really without thinking at all. It's not so much that I do it blatantly, so much as I do it thoughtlessly, with little thought as to whether it's pleasing to the Lord. So many things that I do, if I'm honest, I don't necessarily do for the Lord, but for me, because they're not wrong to do. And I realize that my kind of threshold is it wrong in a lot of ways. And the problem is that if we're living according to commandments, we'll only ask ourselves the question, is there a law against this? If I'm considering doing something, a lot of times it's even implicit. If there's no law against it, it must be fine to do. If there's no rule against it, it must be fine to do. And then I'm free to proceed just because some activity, Just because some activity or indulgence is permissible doesn't mean that it's okay. And the thing that stood out to me in this passage in Romans is this idea of living beyond permissibility, not just doing things by default, not thinking twice about them because there's no law against them, but rather, as the Colossians passage says, we're called to be pleasing to God in all respects, not just to avoid what's wrong, quote unquote wrong. And instead of only being alert to the question of, is this wrong? The question that God brought to my mind a lot this week was, Lord, are you pleased with me doing this? Not is it wrong, but are you pleased with me doing this? And I've got a long way to grow in that attitude of constant examination and of constant dependence, because when I think about all respects, that's a really all-encompassing statement. Be pleasing to the Lord in all respects. At the end of that same passage in Romans 14, it says in verse 22, it says, the faith which you have as your own conviction before God. This really struck me. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. And whatever is not from faith is sin. And what I see here is that we need to seek to do all things by faith. Everything we do, we should be doing by faith. And faith, as we know, as we've heard many times from this pulpit, is full confidence in God and childlike dependence upon him. And so as I think about being pleasing to the Lord in all respects, what that makes me think is, it makes me examine a lot of the areas of my life differently as it relates to, am I doing this out of faith, out of full dependence upon God? Or am I just defaulting to, I know it's not wrong, so it's okay. And but that being said, if we don't condemn ourselves, I mean, this verse is clear. Romans 14, verse 22 says, happy is he who doesn't condemn himself in what he approves. That means if we don't condemn ourselves in something that we've chosen, it's good. This isn't meant to cast doubt upon every moment or activity of the day necessarily. But, however, when we consider this phrase of doing all things from faith, if the Holy Spirit calls to mind some activity or some indulgence, as he often does me, if I think about that, it's not that I all of a sudden question everything, but there are a couple things I go, am I doing that of faith? The thing that verse 23 says to me, that this verse says, he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. What that says to me is, don't continue doing something if you doubt whether it's of faith. That we should seek to be fully assured that what we do is done for God, to please him in all respects before we proceed. And not to live life by default, but rather by dependence. Because it's so tempting to treat many aspects of our lives as things that we don't need to depend on, because surely God isn't concerned with this little thing, right? But he does care about even little details, and the thing that he cares about particularly is, was this done with an honest consideration of whether it would be pleasing to me? That's what God's asking. Was this, whatever he did, was it done with an honest consideration of whether it was pleasing to me? Was it done out of a heart that said, all my life is for you, God. Everything I'm doing for the Lord. Whether I eat, I'm eating for the Lord. If I choose not to eat, the reason I'm choosing not to eat is for the Lord. And that really shed light on what does it mean to be pleasing to God in all respects. To me, the question is, am I doing it for the Lord? Whether I eat or whether I don't eat, whether I observe the day, whether I don't observe the day. Can I say with a clean conscience, I'm doing it for the Lord? And those things which I haven't affirmatively decided, this is for the Lord, then don't keep proceeding and eat while doubting and thus condemn yourself, because anything that isn't done of faith is sin. And my prayer, as I've been considering this, is, God, give me discernment and help me grow in my dependence upon you. Help me discern those things which I've ignored, those things which I've done out of dependence upon you, and help me surrender them to you. And don't get into some cycle of condemnation where I start questioning everything, but really just say, if I'm not condemned in what I eat, I'm happy. But if the Holy Spirit kind of just tells me, hey, you haven't even, just ask God. I think I shared about a year ago maybe, there was something in my mind. I had done something, and I thought later, oh no, was that wrong? And I heard a word very clearly from the Lord. It wasn't wrong, but I wish you would have asked me. I just wish you would have asked me. It's fine to do it, fine to not do it. But the thing that I want for you is that you would ask me before you decide it. And it's in these little things, in these little areas of life. The one example I have from my life is, I'm trying to eat more healthfully. As far as I can tell, that's a good idea, But God even convicted me of that when I'm making decisions about what I'm eating, am I doing it for the Lord? Or am I doing it because I want to be healthy? Am I doing it because I want to, I have some personal motive? Or do I say, God, even my choice in eating, I want to do it for you? So a simple example, but for me, God, give me the discernment that I need to know those areas where I'm not depending upon you, and help me grow in my dependence upon you so that I might please you in all respects in my life. So we'll have a time of singing together now and praising the Lord, and then as we did last week, as we mentioned in the email, we'll have a time for each of the three elders to share a few words that God's placed on our hearts.